So today, I ran a game of Dungeons and Dragons. Well, it wasn't technically Dungeons and Dragons. It didn't use that official rule set or the pre-made world that they have, but it was a fantasy role-playing game. Two friends and I got together, and we sat down at a table, and we made stuff up and told a story together. The two of them played their own characters, and I played everyone else. I played the villains, and all of the extras, all of the little characters, the bit parts, the people who helped them or hindered them, and I also helped tell the story. I narrated things that happened, I set the scenes, I answered their questions. If they wanted to do something, they told me what they did, and I would tell them what happened, or what other people would do in response. And so it was a lot of pressure on me to figure out what would happen, and to ensure that they had the information that they needed to drive the story along, and that the things that happened were interesting. It was a little stressful and a little scary, but it was also a lot of fun. I haven't really done that before. I've run a few games here and there, but this was a little different. It was pretty intense and heavily improvised. I decided what we'd do about 10 minutes before people showed up, which is not typically how you approach things. Usually there's quite a bit more preparation involved, but I was planning to have 3 people come, and I had a certain something in mind, but unfortunately one of them couldn't show up, and so I decided to do something different on a whim. Something I'd kind of brainstormed about and had the ideas for a couple of years ago, but never really did anything with the ideas. And then it just kind of seemed like, oh, maybe this is the opportunity to do something with those ideas. And I did. And it probably would have benefited from a bit more preparation, but I managed to do it. I improvised, I thought on my feet, and I pulled it off. I didn't exactly stick the landing. It was a little uneven and pretty chaotic and kind of stressful, but it was also fun. We all had a good time, and that's what matters. That's why you play. And importantly, I made plenty of mistakes, and I learned from them. Some of them, at least. I'm sure that my brain will go over and over and over all sorts of little things that happened, and I'll learn from them. That's what the brain does. It just processes and reprocesses old information, and then it tries to learn from it. So, yeah, I made plenty of mistakes, but I'll learn from them. It's what I want to do. I don't know if I'm going to run more games anytime soon, but I want to try and learn how to be better. I want to read up on how to do things better, look at examples of games that other people have run, and maybe plan out and prepare things a little better. But I had a good time, and I'm proud of myself. I'm proud of myself for getting through it, for thinking on my feet and doing a pretty good job. And I'm proud of myself for confronting something that was kind of scary and uncomfortable. I wasn't terribly confident in this. It was largely a new thing. It draws on a bunch of skills that I've already developed to some degree, but it also required a lot of skills that I haven't really pursued at all, and that can be intimidating. There's not just the prospect of failure, but a high likelihood of failure. But it's something that I've wanted to do for a while, and I just did it. I was aware that it was a little scary, and there were parts of my brain telling me, no, maybe don't do this. But I overrode that. I said, no, this is something I want to do. And even though the conditions weren't optimal, and I hadn't really prepared what I'd wanted to do, I did it anyway. And I had faith in myself that I would be able to do it. And I did it. That faith was well-placed, well-founded. And I guess that's kind of the takeaway point, that we're often more competent than we give ourselves credit for. And we can actually handle quite a lot of things, even if they're uncomfortable. And by doing that, by embracing difficult situations and confronting the prospect of failure, confronting when we do fail, and instead of fearing that or beating ourselves up for it, learning from it, becoming better at things that we want to do or things that we might have to do. That's a pretty important realization to come to. And it's something that I probably say a lot in theory, but don't necessarily do in practice. But today I did it. And I'm proud of myself for that. And I hope that maybe that might inspire you to do the same. But anyway, let's talk about the game, shall we? So, here's the elevator pitch. It was a medieval fantasy buddy cop movie. It's basically the 80s action movie Lethal Weapon, but in a D&D style medieval world. So I called it Martial Weapon instead. It's a little joking reference to the weapon proficiencies in D&D. If you use swords and things like that, you're proficient with martial weapons. Not lethal, you know. So anyway, it was basically this idea I had like 2 years ago, and the idea was that 2 players would be town guards in a medieval fantasy world. The city I ended up going with was called Hightown, and it was a fairly large, prosperous city. There was not a lot of magic and, a fair amount of racial diversity. There's elves and half-orcs and dwarves and things like that. And basically the idea was that the 2 of them are beat cops. They're low-level town guards who just sort of patrol around, and they happen to stumble upon something that's maybe a little above their pay grade. So we started off by making their characters, and I knew that I wanted their characters to be opposites, probably different races with a different kind of cultural attitude towards them. Their classic mismatched pair, very trope heavy in the buddy cop department. I was originally thinking maybe like an elf and a dwarf who didn't really get along, but eventually learned to respect each other. But my players took that in a different direction, and one of them decided to be a halfling, which is basically like a hobbit, if you've seen Lord of the Rings. They're small, plucky, courageous little guys. And he decided that he wanted to have a little man complex, a Napoleon complex, where he sort of bit off more than he could chew. He wrote checks that his body couldn't cash. He was aggressive and tenacious and very small, but prone to violence and reckless activity and things like that. And he has a drinking problem, but he's also a real lightweight, so he'd have like a little thimble full of whiskey or something. And he was kind of like reluctantly adorable, so he'd rub people the wrong way, but they couldn't really stay mad at him. and his partner was a drow. A drow is a dark elf. It's a subterranean creature, this underground dweller. They have very dark skin, jet black skin, and white hair, and they revere spiders, and culturally they're known for being sneaky, backstabbing, upward social climbers. They tend not to be very well liked by people because of that. So the other player kind of liked the idea of playing this straight-laced, by-the-book kind of character who was combating a lot of social prejudice. They're both kind of mismatched reject characters, the runts of the litter, so to speak, the police officers that don't really get taken seriously. So yeah, they're both kind of underdogs, I guess. So with that in mind, we got started. They were walking their beat, patrolling Old Street, one of the poorer, less well-maintained sections of the city, and they roamed around, and then they saw a flash of light, a bright purplish blue flash of light. They didn't hear any strange noise or anything like that, but they saw this flash of light, and then footsteps quickly running away. See, the drow player, apparently his character had a fondness for ringing a bell as he patrolled the streets, letting people know that everything was all right, which wasn't terribly popular with the local citizens because he had the night shift and people were trying to sleep. But apparently the bell kind of scared away whoever this shadowy figure was. And so they rounded the corner, chasing after this figure, when they saw a body exploded, just blown to bits. This purplish blue scorch mark still fresh on the ground and the walls. And they saw this figure bolting away from them. So they gave chase. Now, unfortunately, halflings are pretty small and their legs are a little short and stubby, so the halfling player wasn't great at chasing after this fellow. Instead, he decided to climb a tall building and get a vantage point so that he could direct his fellow officer, the drow, to chase after him. And they didn't really run that well, so the guy was kind of getting away, but then apparently he ended up in an alley, and it was a dead end. So he turns around, and he faces the drow, and eventually the halfling got there too. And the guy turns around, his eyes are blazing with purplish blue energy, and he looks at them, and he's laughing to himself, short of breath. He looks intense, like he's on some kind of drug, and then he proclaims himself to be a living god. And naturally, the players are kind of alarmed at this and unsure of how to proceed. They haven't seen anything like this before, but this guy seems to be serious business. He's emitting this bright glow of energy, and so the halfling walks up to him and takes out his truncheon and gives him a little jab in the stomach with it. The guy bends over, doubled over in pain, and then puts his hands out to the halfling and sends him flying away with this burst of arcane energy. And then things take a turn for the worse. The drow guard, seeing his friend sent flying, takes a shot with his crossbow and fires at this magical man. And he hits him in the chest. But the guy doesn't really seem to mind that much. He's kind of out of it. And then he starts arcing electricity out of his body. He starts levitating off the ground, and things steadily get worse. The guy's glowing, emanating heat. He's taking a few more crossbow bolts and a few hits from a truncheon, but still the energy is just pouring out of this guy. He's glowing more and more, levitating off the ground. He's leaving scorch marks on the walls as he leans up against them. The halfling player got a clothesline and tried to wrap it around this guy and pin him to a wall, which was successful. But unfortunately, this guy was giving off more and more energy, more and more heat, and eventually he started to explode. So naturally, the players rushed out of the way. They happened to evacuate the buildings, with the drow players' fairly irritating bell coming in handy, and then the guy exploded, seemingly overloaded with magical energy. And he happened to destroy 2 apartment blocks and some of the street, which wasn't exactly ideal, but at least nobody else seemed to get seriously injured. So the players head back to the police precinct after cleaning up a little, and they get chewed out by the police captain. Because you got it, right? So they get brought into the office, and this angry dwarf chews them out and tells them that they blew up 2 apartment blocks, that the mayor's on his ass, and that he's up to his neck in parchment work, and both of them are loose cannons that didn't follow procedure and should have called in for backup, that they should have left it to the experts who are properly trained to deal with this sort of thing. Not that anyone really is properly trained to deal with this sort of thing. So they get yelled at by the police chief, and they get told to hand over all the evidence, and that the case is now in the hands of the very capable Griffin Inquisitors, who are like the handsome, pretty boy detectives, the golden boys of the department that everybody loves, and that they get all the credit for everything. But no. That won't sit well with the halfling player, so he keeps a little evidence for himself. Glass vial that contains a strange symbol seems to point to some supplier for this magical drug, whatever it is. So they do a little legwork, and they chase up a few leads, and they find out that this magical drug was supplied by some company called Albright. And they do a little more digging, and they find out that, Albright supplies alchemical reagents and potions and tinctures and things like that, but nothing in the little vials that they describe. So they happen to stumble upon a wagon belonging to Albright, and they follow it. They see the driver taking crates and delivering it to various alchemists and apothecaries. And then later on, the driver starts making smaller deliveries to rather shady-looking people in alleyways, just handing them 1 or 2 small vials in exchange for bags of gold. So the players decide to rough up one of the shady-looking guys who just paid quite a lot of money for some small glass vials, and eventually, with a little pressure applied, they find out that this particular guy was trying to buy some magical drug, which apparently is known under the street name of Arcane. It's spelled Arcane, like cocaine, but magic. It's a glowing blue powder that people snort, and then it gives them magical abilities. Anyway, this guy was going to buy some and then sell it to someone else, but the players end up confiscating the arcane. And after putting some more pressure on this particular suspect, doing a little legwork, investigating some leads, they find out where the drug is coming from. It's a warehouse in the Wharf District, and during a stakeout, they see a cart being loaded with boxes at this particular warehouse, and then it leaves the heavily guarded establishment. They follow the cart and watch a drug deal going down, and then they decide to pounce. Unfortunately, the customer takes the arcane. And not only that, but the driver of the cart has a weapon of his own. He takes out a small hexagonal stick of wood, silver in color, and aims it at the halfling, shooting a fireball out, nearly scorching him. One of the sides of the wand turns black as it gets used up. This wasn't really expanded upon in the game, but basically the wands were meant to be analogous to revolvers. 6 shots, gets used up. I was planning for them to have a high-speed cart chase where the wands would be going off and causing a whole bunch of collateral damage, and there'd be explosions here and there, but things went a little differently, and it turns out that they took a stealthier, more investigative approach. It was meant to be more of an action movie with a lot of set pieces in between, but they sort of did a lot more digging and police work. I hadn't really prepared for that, so I wasn't great at handing out information and clues, but we got there in the end. Basically, they fought a superpowered magical guy whose blood was molten and eventually burned him from the inside out, and they also fought the driver, who had a magic wand but was quickly disarmed. So they had a magic wand and 2 vials of arcane and a bag full of money and the location and a little information about the source of the drug. Unfortunately for them, during the fight, the wand of fireball happened to miss the halfling, mostly, but it smashed into the cart and set it on fire, which made the horse run away. And then the cart full of alchemical reagents was on fire, so there was a lot of explosions popping off here and there. The cart was burning. The drow managed to grab onto it and then eventually gain control of the horse enough to head it towards the wharf so that it would plow off into the water. And he managed to cut the leather straps just in time so that he and the horse were freed and able to float away, but the cart plowed into the waterfront, and there was a great big explosion, but thankfully it was underwater, and so thankfully there was just a great big plume of water that exploded up into the air. But everyone was more or less okay. They arrested the car driver, and then decided that they would make a raid on the warehouse. Even though they didn't really have probable cause or a warrant or anything like that, they decided to just infiltrate things. The by-the-book approach wasn't really working for them, so they decided to follow the halfling's instinct for being a loose cannon and a renegade. They snuck in, and then they got into a fight with some guards, and it wasn't going well. I happened to roll really well as the guards, and so I basically almost killed the drow, and kinda almost killed the halfling as well. But the halfling decided that a risky course of action was going to be his best bet. So he took a vial of arcane, and he started to gain magical powers. He decided to use his magical powers, and to see how well he did, he rolled dice. And then he got the highest number that he could get. So I decided that he could narrate whatever he wanted. He effectively became all-powerful for a brief moment, and so he telekinetically picked up a horse and then hit the horse into 3 guards and smashed them up against a wall. Now, this wasn't particularly kind to the horse, who admittedly had already been through a pretty bad day, but that's the way he wanted to do it, and I let him. So he took care of all 3 guards and then healed his friend. He healed the drow by channeling the flaming energy of the nearby burning warehouse. Oh, I forgot to mention a stray firebolt set the warehouse on fire, and it was full of alchemical reagents, so lots of explosions. He channeled that flaming energy and then cauterized the wounds of his drow friend, so that the drow basically was good as new. Had some pretty nasty scars, but he was feeling a lot better considering he was basically at death's door. And that just happened to be their lucky break. So then the all-powerful halfling and the not terribly powerful drow infiltrated the compound. They handily dispatched a few more guards, and then down the end of the hallway, up the stairs, was the drug lord. Now, previously they were coming up with names for their characters, and one suggested El Daffodilio, which was kind of a dumb name, but I kind of liked it, so I decided that the drug lord, an elf, would be called El Daffodilio. And so I pulled out my fairly bad Scarface impression, and El Daffodilio snorted a whole bunch of arcane and suddenly became very, very, very powerful, and the halfling and the elf, El Daffodilio, had a sort of impromptu wizard battle with their magical powers. The elf had taken significantly more of the drug and was very powerful, but as is common with this sort of trope in stories, he took too much and was searing with power. It was blazing out of him. The halfling froze him in place, and from the elf's hands there was this energy that was arcing out, this raw magical energy that was so brilliant and powerful, it was burning everything around it. And so, together, the halfling and the drow took one of the elves' arms each and brought them down so that this surging magical current of energy came down to his head and basically kind of fried his brain and the rest of him as well, I suppose. It was a pretty gruesome, grisly end, but they did it. They beat the bad guy. El Daffodilian was dead, and just in time for them to jump out a window and be flown to safety by the halfling as everything caught on fire and exploded because it was just littered with alchemical reagents. The halfling flew off and decided to burn off the rest of the magical energy from the drug that he'd ingested, and the drow was left with an awful lot of paperwork and an angry rant from the police chief. But he liked paperwork, so it kind of was a happy ending, I suppose. They got chewed out, certainly, but they solved the case and destroyed all of the drugs and put a stop to all of that, so yay. Happy ending, kind of. It potentially sets them up for a sequel, I suppose, and certainly that's something I could do in the future. Maybe there'll be a bunch of Dragonborn who have diplomatic immunity. But, yeah, there's plenty of stories that could be told. Sequels or brand new ideas for different games. But I think I want to take some time to learn a bit more and develop my skills, particularly before I commit to anything long-term. But I tried something new, and I'm proud of myself for doing that. I think I certainly enjoy playing more than I do running things, especially at this stage, and I'm not really that great with the overall plot of things or preparing that much, but I had a good time. I like playing lots of little characters and showing off the diversity of voices I can do, and I've got lots of interesting, funny ideas for things. Maybe I'm more of a small picture guy than a big picture guy, but I had fun. And so did both my players. And that felt good. They got to feel like cool action heroes, and we all laughed a lot, and we bonded and told a story together. And that was a special, memorable experience. and I'd like to do that more. Just maybe not right away. But I'm proud of myself for doing it, and I'm glad I could talk to you about it too. Thanks for listening.